Call the Board of Selectmen meeting back to order. So the next appointment we have on our agenda this evening is a joint discussion with the Hingham Board of Selectmen. So at this time, I'm just going to recognize Chair of the Hingham Board of Selectmen, Mr. Healy. Mr. Healy?
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Paul Healy. I'm the chairman of the Hingham Planning Board. At this time, I'd call the
Board of Selectmen?
Freudian slip.
Thursday.
Board of Selectmen. Yeah, I'm calling to order the meeting of the Hingham Board of Selectmen. I served 19 years on the planning board, so it's somewhat reflexive. And I'd like to introduce my colleagues. Beside me is Mary Power, Karen Johnson, our town administrator, Tom Mayo, our town council, John Coughlin, Mr. John Asher, who's the chair of the Water Study Acquisition Committee. In the audience joining us is our DPW superintendent, Randy Sylvester, our chief of police, Glenn Olson. So thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Everyone from Hingham, welcome. It's nice to have you this evening.
Thank you.
So just to give everyone a little sense of process, what we're going to do is I'm going to recognize Selectwoman Powers in a few moments, who's going to give us a presentation. We anticipate it's approximately 30 minutes, give or take. At that point, then I'm going to come back to the Hull Board of Selectmen for questions, statements, and comments. And then once we're done with that, I'm going to go to members of the public for any questions or comments. I do ask you if you could just identify yourself with your name and address, and also if you're from the town of Hingham or Hull. This is quite unusual. Typically, we're all from Hull, but Catherine, who does do our minutes, will want to know and distinguish where your address is located. So if you could do that, that would be much appreciated. Okay, without further ado, I'm going to recognize Selectwoman Powers, who's going to take the podium. Mary, this should be the clicker up there for you. Yep. Clicker.
I was facilitating a meeting last week, and I started walking with this clicker, and I was hitting it, and it wasn't advancing, and I realized that I had forgotten to turn it on. So hopefully we'll be better this evening. Good evening. I'm Mary Power, and thank you so much for being here this evening, and our thanks to Town Manager Lemnios and the Select Board for giving us the opportunity to talk about something pretty important that has the potential to affect all of us. As many of you are aware, the town of Hingham has been considering the possibility of purchasing the water company for about 7 years. And over the next about 30 minutes, our Board of Selectmen is going to try to highlight some of the things that we learned along with our study, some of the things that compelled us to make the study, what we as ratepayers, and we are all ratepayers in the room and customers of the water company, what we could expect under municipal ownership, and then leave time for some questions. So we look forward to those as well. You know, just as a means of summary, you know, people have sort of said, why does the Board of Selectmen think this is a good idea? And there are a couple of things. We think that municipal ownership will give every ratepayer a greater voice in decisions. We think it will improve transparency. We think it will result in lower and slower water rate increases. We think it will mean that more of the money that we all pay in our water bills will work for us. We think it will lead to greater coordination with town departments in Hingham, in Hull, in North Cohasset. And we think it gives us a greater ability to protect the watershed, another very shared interest. The Hingham Water Company was actually founded in 1879 by a group of about 12 Hingham residents. And the way it was founded was a statute. It was a special act that went to the Massachusetts legislature. And it essentially spelled out a lot of things. And believe it or not, we go back to that statute many, many times on many things. That statute really is governing how we've had to approach this work and how this decision would be made. The founding statute includes a couple of things that are important. First of all, it provides the right to purchase the water system from a private owner. And that's a right that the town of Hingham has had for over 130 years. And I will say at the outset that the way the statute is defined is that that right is given to the citizens of the town of Hingham. If the town of Hingham wanted to exercise that right, Aquarion is obligated to sell the system. There's no choice in that, but what the statute does do is it lays out a formula to ensure that the owner of the water company is given fair compensation. The water company has always been privately owned for about 130 years, and up until about 2002, we've heard many people characterize it as having the feel of a locally owned water company. In 2002, what we knew as American Water was sold to a British company named Kelda. That's when we all became part of Aquarion. 5 years later, Kelda, a British company, sold the water company to Macquarie, an Australian company. And as many of us know, in 2017, Macquarie sold Aquarion Water Company to Eversource Energy, which is the current owner. Just going back to 2012 for a moment, Hingham initiated the feasibility study. It wasn't something that we were looking to do to be opportunistic. It was in a response to a number of concerns and issues that were brought to our attention by citizens, by town departments, and they included having the 5th highest water rates in the state, and despite that, what we would characterize as a break-and-fix water main strategy. In our water system collectively, there are about 190 miles of water mains underneath the ground. And we had circumstances where water main, one in particular, broke 5 times in 1 year, and Aquarion said that it couldn't be replaced for another year because of a limited capital budget. The town of Hingham began a road building program in 2011, similar to the road building program that Hull started undertaking this past year. And we were finding that there wasn't a lot of coordination with the water company, and that was actually compromising the effectiveness of our road building plan. We were concerned about ownership changes after decades of stability. You know, like many of you, we found out our water company had a new owner by picking up the newspaper and reading about it. Nobody ever talked to us about it. There weren't public meetings like the ones we've been having for the last few months. And when we saw 2 ownership changes within 5 years, that really caused a lot of concern. And moreover, when our water company moved from being kind of this local water company to being part of a bigger corporation, what we found is that the needs of the shareholders became, in many cases, in conflict with what the right thing to do is with the ratepayers. You know, as a member of the advisory committee said last night, corporations are to earn a profit for their shareholders, and that's not a judgment, that's just a fact. And in the corporate world, your shareholders come first. And I think what we started seeing in 2012 was that there were decisions being made to the shareholders' best benefit that were not in the water system's best interest. So in 2012, the feasibility study began with, we had convened a water company acquisition study committee, of which Mr. Asher was the chair. After a year of initial study, the committee determined that they didn't find any showstoppers. And I should say, the committee didn't set out to prove that town ownership was a good idea. They actually set out to see, is there a reason that we shouldn't? They were looking for reasons to not do it. But what they did point out to us is that without a firm purchase price, the feasibility study really couldn't form any conclusions. And at that time, the town's estimate of the value of the water system was about $60 million, and Aquarion valued at about $190 million, and said the water treatment plant wasn't part of the acquisition. So obviously, we had a difference of opinion. The litigation took about 4.5 years. That feels really long to me, but I think all the lawyers in the room, and there seem to be a lot of them tonight, would say that that's common. In some ways, that's kind of quick. But in 2018, about a year ago at this time, the litigation concluded, and we had a firm purchase price. At that point, we looked at that purchase price, we looked at the economics and said, this still makes sense to consider. So since that time, we've been doing a lot of more detailed work on topics like operations, how it will be run, governance, how it will be structured, and financing. How are we going to pay for it? There was one other piece of information that we needed to do to finalize that, and that was to see the results of the recent rate case that was filed with the Department of Public Utilities. And on October 31st, that announcement was made. And at that time, the town handed over its financial analysis, along with a 77-page rate case decision, to 2 independent financial experts who had never done any work with the town of Hingham, and said, take a look at our financial model, tell us if it makes sense, and by the way, with this rate case, could you please update the financial analysis for the results of the rate case? That work was completed in January. I'll give you a few highlights, but at the end of the month, the Board of Selectmen in Hingham submitted warrant articles for town meeting's consideration. Some things we learned. There are 351 communities in Massachusetts. 337 of them are served by a publicly owned water system. That's either a municipally owned water system, a water district, or the MWRA. And that translates to about 32,000 customers, including all of us, who are serviced by a public entity. And as Karen will talk a little bit later, if you drill down even deeper and you look at water systems of our size, and the most meaningful way to look at that is number of connections. There are 41 water systems of our size. We are the only one that is privately owned. We also learned a lot about the role that the DEP, the Department of Environmental Protection, would play. And what we learned is that the DEP regulates both the water supply and water system operators in exactly the same way, regardless of ownership. So what we learned is that the very important role the DEP plays in controlling the water supply and regulating water quality is unchanged. So what that says to us is this is going to be the same plant, the same operating standards, the same quality requirements and monitoring. And what we also learned with consultation with our legal team and the DEP is that if Hingham Town Meeting votes to acquire the water system, there's a period of what's called good husbandry. And this is a legal requirement that essentially says until the town of Hingham has completed the transition activities to the DEP's satisfaction, Aquarion has a legal obligation to continue to manage the water system. The rates will be the same. If a water main breaks, it will be fixed. Everything will be the same until the town of Hingham is ready to assume responsibility. And the DEP assists communities in doing that. I want to talk about a couple learnings about our water system because I think some of these have bearing to the Hull community as well. One of our biggest conclusions is that our water system hasn't been very well maintained. And the graph that you see on the bottom of this slide actually came from Aquarion in the most recent rate case. And the bar on the very far left is 2005, and on the far right is 2017. And each bar represents the number of feet of water mains replaced in Hingham, Hull, and North Cohasset in a given year. So for example, in 2005, about 500 feet was replaced out of 190 miles. In 2007, 0. In 2011, about 1,500 feet of water main. And if you look at that red line that's at the top of the page, that indicates 10,000 linear feet, which is about 2 miles. In 2016, Aquarion actually commissioned a capital study that gave it guidance and recommendations on how much water mains should be replaced in our system every year to take good care of it. And that's 10,000 feet. And if you look in the last 12 years, we've never come close to 10,000 feet. We also learned that our road building program has been compromised by emergency street openings. In Hingham, we've started a road building program that is very similar, I believe, to the one that Hull has adopted in the past year. So what we do is we go out and we look at the streets that need to be repaved or resurfaced, and then we sit down with the utilities. We sit down with National Grid, we sit down with the water company, and we say, hey, we're replacing, we're going to repair this street, and this is a really good opportunity if you have something under the ground to replace it. We've had wonderful cooperation from National Grid. Just last night, our board granted a location to replace 6,000 feet of gas line all along Main Street. The same has not been true for the water company because, in fact, if you look at it, there really just hasn't been much investment in the system. Now, in Hingham, when a road is resurfaced, we put a 5-year moratorium on it. And we say you can't open up that road for 5 years because as soon as you open up a road, it degrades its quality. You never get it back. It's kind of like when your car goes into that shop for that first fender bender, never quite kind of drives the same. And what we have found, because we keep really careful data on this, is that 22% of the roads that we have repaired or rehabilitated in the last 7 years have had to have emergency street openings for emergency water repairs. Some of them more than once. And while we wouldn't expect that every water main would be replaced or there would be zero breaks, as we've looked at Aquarion capital studies from 2011, 2007, 2014, we see streets that come up time and time again. And some of these streets the town has repaved, and it was a missed opportunity. So as taxpayers and ratepayers, we continue to be paying money to open up the same road multiple times. Doesn't make a lot of sense. We learned that whether a water company is privately or publicly owned, all the costs of running it are paid by us as water customers or ratepayers. That's the direct costs like the chemicals and the people who work in the plant. It's indirect costs, including any sort of overhead, billing, customer service. In the case of a privately owned water company, legal and public relations fees for rate cases, and the cost of capital improvements. And we would also say that those emergency capital improvements tend to cost more because they often happen after hours. We learned that water companies are profitable, and we think that explains why the current owners of the water company are very compelled and very motivated to hang on to the water company. The Department of Public Utilities, which is the rate-setting agency for privately owned utilities, they basically allow a utility to put in a rate case that allows you to achieve a 10.5% to 14.5% rate of return. As our financial experts said, you know, the DPU is compelled to make sure that these monopoly utilities are financially viable, because in many communities, especially with electrical service, they provide a service. The most recent rate case authorized a 10.5% annual return, and it also authorized a 2% surcharge for water mains. And, you know, really interesting to us, but about 3 weeks ago we learned that that actually rate case is being appealed right now. Aquarion is looking to increase their capital surcharge called MRAM from 2% to 3%. So again, what that tells us is we understand that we have an aging infrastructure. The average age of the water mains is over 60 years. The average age of the water mains here in Hull is older than that. We have a lot of catch-up work to do. And as we look at the most recent rate case, what it confirms for us is, doesn't matter who owns our water company, we as ratepayers are going to pay for all those repairs to the system. So the question is there a difference in terms of the economics? Would it be more financially feasible under municipal ownership? And according to our study, and Mr. Asher can give you more detail, we learned that municipal ownership can eliminate about half the costs that Aquarion currently is incurring right now without affecting service. The biggest expenses that we pay for in our water rates are for things like profit to shareholders, rent that Aquarion pays to itself, federal and state taxes, and rate filing costs. Right now, Aquarion collects just over $13 million from all of us as ratepayers, and about $7 million of that would be eliminated under town ownership, and I repeat, that wouldn't affect service. We also know that municipal entities have lower borrowing costs, so if we think about capital improvements, according to the work that we've done, the town of Hingham's borrowing rates are a full 2 percentage points lower than Aquarion. So if you're replacing a water main for $1 million and you're going to, you're going to bond that project, in the town of Hingham, we can do that for an interest rate of, 3.25%. Aquarion is at least 5.25%, if not higher. So again, if we think about where our dollars are working and who they're working for. So what that also allowed us to conclude is that under municipal ownership, if you're removing about half the cost, you're creating more than enough capacity to pay the debt service on the purchase. And in fact, what we found is that the financial savings to ratepayers are significant. This is a bar chart that shows it, but according to the town's analysis, in the first 30 years of town ownership, the total 30-year savings conservatively are just under $50 million. Now, what that means is that means lower and slower rate increases. Because under municipal ownership, we wouldn't be collecting revenue to make a profit. And any money that's collected is put back into the system. In year 31, when the acquisition debt's paid off, or I like to think of it as, the mortgage is paid off, all of a sudden then the savings increase to $7.4 million each year in 30 years. And again, what that means for the future is lower and slower rate increases, more money to invest in capital. And as we think about some of the infrastructure, for example, the water treatment plant, we think that in 30 years there will be some substantial capital investment required in that facility. What this slide shows is that under municipal ownership, we could absorb that capital cost without increasing rates. We learned that the purchase price as of April 22nd of 2019 is approximately $108 million. And because of the way the formula works, it increases by about $3 to $4 million a year. We've been hearing a lot of people saying, gee, Hingham, you're going a little too fast on this, and maybe you should study it a little bit more. I think it's worth noting that if we waited 5 years, the cost of this company would go up by between $15 and $20 million. We also learned, and Karen will talk about this, but by structuring this as an enterprise fund, it provides a safeguard to make sure that all of the money that we're all paying in our water bills is going to remain in that system. I've heard some people a little concerned about, well, what's to stop Hingham from taking $1 million of profit from the water company and using it to do something in Hingham that doesn't benefit Hull ratepayers? The enterprise fund doesn't let us do that. We couldn't do it if we want to, and we certainly don't want to. This is a system that needs millions and millions of dollars in repair. Frankly, I think it would be a good problem to have if we said, gosh, we've done all the repairs and we still have all this money and we don't know what to do. That's going to be a conversation that our children or our grandchildren are going to be having. Just two quick things before I turn it over to Karen. We learned that Aquarion has spent over $2.7 million in public relations fees through May of last year. Now, that doesn't include all of the forums and the mailers and the phone banks that have been going on since then. And as part of the DPU rate filing, we actually got copies of all those invoices. It was troubling for us to see things like working with the Hingham Journal to kill a story, calls to senior citizens, a political analysis of our advisory committee. Aquarion is very compelled to maintain the current ownership structure. And I got to be honest with you folks, this feels like a little bit of David and Goliath, because our PR budget is zero. And what it also says to me is that this must be a very, very profitable asset to go to all that trouble. But I'll close with one thing, because I'm a small business operator, and I think what I've learned is the best way to keep your customers is to keep your customers happy. And when I think about $2.7 million, I think of what that could have gone for. And I'll just give you an example from Hull. Atlantic Avenue, in 2011, it was in the top 3 projects for a water main replacement in 2007 in an Aquarion capital plan. 2011, an update to the capital plan. Atlantic Avenue was like in the top 5. 2014, another capital plan. There's Old Atlantic Avenue still on the list. We just looked at a DPU filing that was filed 2 weeks ago with the water main projects, and there's Atlantic Avenue. Why wasn't it been done in the last 12 years? And by the way, the cost for Atlantic Avenue, with $2.7 million, you could have replaced that water main 4 times. I'll close with one other thing. Last August, and some of these pictures look a little familiar. Phil, I didn't get Phil's permission, so I may need to compensate him for this. So last August, I think many of us remember that there was an incident of discolored water that affected 3,500 to 4,000 households and businesses in this community. and that there were businesses who didn't know if they could open, restaurants who didn't know if they could open for business. And it was quite significant. And that was it started on Monday, it went through Tuesday, there was gradual improvement on Wednesday. On Thursday, August 9th, the Select Board met, and I watched your meeting on, your local cable. And I saw a very concerned Select Board asking questions. I saw a concerned town manager who was talking about the steps that had been taken. I saw and listened to many Hull citizens who were really concerned what was going to happen. And what just struck me as so odd was that there wasn't a single person from Aquarion in the room. And, I think about that, and I think it sends a message about accountability. The owners of the water company need to be accountable to all of us as ratepayers. And that means that you got to show up, especially when there's a problem. And interestingly enough, 4 days later, August 13th, 2018, Aquarion held what they've been calling a takeover forum at the South Shore Country Club. The president of Aquarion was there, the vice president of operations, community relations, somebody from the finance team. There were a lot of people from Bridgeport, Connecticut that came down to talk about the wonderful job Aquarion was doing. And I got to tell you, I was watching it and I thought to myself, you are 4 days too late. I'm going to turn it over to Karen, but on behalf of our board, what we would commit to you, the residents of Hull, is that if we have the opportunity, if the town of Hingham has the opportunity to own this water system, we will show up for you. We will listen to you, and you also know where to find us. And if we're not showing up quick enough, you can come on Tuesday night, in open mic night, in front of the cameras, and hold us accountable. You should expect to hold people who are providing essential services to you accountable. The town of Hingham understands that responsibility. We've tried hard to prepare for that responsibility, and I'm going to let Karen describe to you how we intend to carry out that responsibility.
Thank you.
Everybody, I'm Karen Johnson from the Hingham Board of Selectmen, Manager Lemnio, Select Board. Thanks for having us. And as Mary said, we're grateful for the opportunity to come and talk with you tonight, and frankly, kind of excited to come to Hull to talk to you about the work that we've been doing on behalf of the system, because that's what we have, is a public water system that we all share. So again, I appreciate being here tonight. And I'm glad I clicked it the right way, because I'm known not to do that. So, I've given this talk a couple times, and because it's important to me to keep everybody focused on what exactly we are purchasing, I do start with this slide, because we are buying the water system, Service Area A. And as Mary sort of pointed out, we got here not because we wanted to get here, but because we had a year or more of subpar service with significant main breaks in particular locations like Middle Street near the high school in Hingham. And we had, discussions and dialogue with Aquarion about, how are you going to deal with this? Can you fix this? We can't have residents on the same street inconvenienced multiple times. And we actually had Aquarion in, and when I say we, the Board of Selectmen sitting at that time, which wasn't Paul, it wasn't Mary, and it wasn't me. A whole different Board of Selectmen had Aquarion in to talk about what are we going to do? And the answer kind of came back with a shrug, like, well, that one's just not on our list. Well, so, you got to back up. You're the fiduciary of the town, right? You're the Board of Selectmen. You got to figure this out. Your citizens have a problem. And so, and if the vendor's not willing to address the problem, you've got to figure out what your other options are. If it was a regular vendor, you'd fire them, or you certainly wouldn't renew the contract. But this is a monopoly. It's a monopoly over one of our most essential utilities. And so we had to look and find what other solutions we had. And the big solution was the right to purchase, that fortunately the legislature in 1879, as people were saying last night, by candlelight, embedded in a special act that formed the water system. And included in that special act initially Nantasket Beach, and then extended in two successive special acts, the rest of Hull and North Cohasset, but embedding in that special act the right of Hingham to purchase the system. And then, one other point I guess I'll make here is, in sort of trying to figure out what our solutions were to our service concerns, we said to Aquarion, well, we get that you have this corporate structure, and at that point, I think they were owned by Macquarie in Australia, right? And we said, we understand you have this corporate structure. What about if we bought you, and then you operate the water system for us? And listen, I have no problem paying a fair day's wage for a fair day's work with a profit element in there for doing a great job. But we need to be able to direct the priorities, up above. And the answer to that question was no. So as Mary pointed out, the finance people worked first, because if we can't afford it, there's no sense figuring out how we're going to run it, right? And so they moved along, trying to figure out whether there were any, as Mary suggested, showstoppers. They were looking for reasons essentially not to do this. They got through their part of the process, and then we started to pick up our part of the process, which was, okay, well, it's looking like we could afford this, so can we run it? And the governance group, which was Charlie Cristello, some of you know Charlie, former town administrator for the town of Hingham, and Joshua Krumholtz, who's an attorney and also a member of the Water Study Acquisition Committee, and I were charged to work on governance. And we approached governance just like the finance people approached finances. We were looking for reasons to say, no, this is not a good idea for Hingham to run the water system. And we came up with, like the finance group, goals. What should we look at if we're going to determine a structure to run this thing? What should the goals of that structure be? So they were obviously efficient and professional water operation, transparency, a public voice, day one governance with the potential for future flexibility and coordination with our neighbors in Hull and Cohasset. And a little bit about how we did our job. So Charlie, Josh, and I collectively and individually, went through this list of diligence items, including, speaking with representatives from both the Southeast Regional Office and the Central Office of the Mass DEP. In particular, I met with Selectmen Richardson and Phil Lemnios after discussions that Tom Mayo has had, over time with Mr. Lemnios, to make sure that you all were in the loop, to keep you updated as to what we were thinking about in terms of governance. And when I met with your Hull representatives this summer, the points that we tried to make are some of the points I'm making tonight. This is a water system. We're all in this together. We're ratepayers together. We talked about the equitable treatment of all ratepayers, the allocation of capital in accordance with and the allocation of capital in accordance with engineering studies. So what do we have now? And I think it's important to see what we have now and what we're proposing. So at the bottom is the operating company. That's the company that delivers your water to you. And they have a citizens advisory board. It was reconvened by Aquarion in 2013. I have no idea who's on it and no idea if people get paid. Some people have self-identified to us. When we've been at meetings, they'll raise their hand. They'll say that they're on the consumer advisory board. We were invited to a meeting, or told we could come to a meeting, but we were never invited. So, they do have that, but it's not public. Aquarion, as we've said, is owned by Eversource Inc., and Eversource Inc. has a distinguished shareholder group that includes a couple of big investment houses, including BlackRock and Vanguard Group. Eversource acquired Aquarion from Macquarie in 2017 for $1.68 billion. That's New Hampshire, Connecticut, and Massachusetts, 230,000 connections. Service area A is about 13,000 connections. Macquarie owned Aquarion for about 10 years as part of an infrastructure and utility fund, and it doubled its $840 million investment on this deal. Those are a lot of big numbers for our water, and there are a lot of people here or entities that are in this chain that don't care about our water. They care about the return and they care about the big dollars. The proxy statement investment press that I researched describe water as a stable investment which will help Eversource hit its growth targets. Goldman Sachs describes water as blue gold, right? It's a finite resource. It makes intuitive sense that this is a commodity that for-profit entities would seek to control into the future, because who knows, especially at the rate we're going, who knows what's going to happen with our watershed? But we need water. We know that. And as Mary said too, there's nothing wrong with this structure, but the priorities and the incentives for Eversource go up to the red box. They go up to the shareholder box. They don't go down to the green water operating company box. And our priorities as ratepayers and citizens is at the green box. And we believe we can operate that green box without the bluish purple box and certainly without the red box. So here's what we would propose. Well, we have a red box, but it's different. So we would have, our proposal would be that the town of Hingham would hire a licensed water superintendent. That would be a person that would be a Hingham employee. And we would hire a water operating company, the water system operator, and the water system operator would in turn hire one or more specialized capital vendors depending on what work needs to be done. But the water superintendent would be the person on the town's payroll that would represent the interests of all the ratepayers in conversations with the water operator. We felt strongly that we needed someone who could talk the talk with the water operator to be sure that the contracts that we sign up and the expectations that we have for operation are being implemented. Now, again, the Department of Environmental Protection, the water operator will be responsible to the Department of Environmental Protection, but this is another layer, I think, of ensuring that the water quality and the operation of the water company is consistent with our expectations. That individual would report up to the town administrator, to the Hingham Board of Selectmen as the water commissioners. We thought it was important to institutionalize a citizens advisory board with 5 members. We would look to Hull to submit a recommendation for a member. There'd be 3 members from Hingham and 1 similarly selected by the Board of Selectmen in Cohasset. We envisioned that group working with the water superintendent and the Hingham Board of Selectmen on rate setting and customer complaints. So to distinguish this from the Citizens or Consumer Advisory Board you saw on the prior slide, this is a public body. It's going to have to meet in the high school or in the town hall just like this. It's going to have to keep minutes. You're going to know who's on that board, and they're all volunteers. The other thing that we thought was important was a transition and evaluation committee. And this sort of evolved over time, to be honest with you, because I think we all understood that this day one structure was just that, a day one structure to be able to run the water company as soon as we purchase it. But we need to evaluate what's best for all of us, including our neighbors in Hull and Cohasset going forward. So this group would be a group appointed by our town moderator and a couple of appointments by the Board of Selectmen. And they would advise the water superintendent with respect to transition tasks, because this is new. And we wanted more bandwidth to help us with those technical tasks. And we will also ask that group to review the number of different ways you could, in fact, structure a system like this. So there's a bunch of options under Massachusetts law. You can combine water with sewer, potentially combine water with light. You could go back to the legislature with a special act if you come up with your own secret sauce for how this thing should work. But we need something that works on day one. We need something that embeds a public voice, and we need something that ensures the quality of the water. And we believe this governance structure does just that. So just to give you some further comfort on our analysis, as Mary said, we are categorized as a medium-sized water system because we have 13,000 connections. Medium-sized connections in the Commonwealth are anywhere from 10,000 to 25,000 connections. There are 41 systems in that cohort. We are the only ones that are owned by a for-profit entity. Every municipality in this cohort runs their water as a department of the municipality except us. We're the outlier. And it's one thing to like lag behind, but to be completely out in left field, that says something else. And then the other thing I guess I want to point out on this slide, and we can talk about later, because I know it's come up at a bunch of the Hingham meetings, is the other thing we found out is, maybe not to the degree we provide water to Hull, but every single municipality in the Commonwealth either provides water to or gets water from some other municipality. And that includes both bulk water sales as well as direct sales to customers. That includes one municipality servicing pipe in another municipality. So again, while the numbers may not be as large as the provision of water to Hull, I think I take away a couple things. One, this is a medium-sized system, not a jumbo system. So when I talked with the Department of Environmental Protection about, well, gee, we have our neighbors in Hull in particular that make up about a third of our system, the gentleman at the DEP just shrugged his shoulders. He's like, that's what municipalities do. So again, not to this degree perhaps, but we're not reinventing the wheel here. And it certainly was not an issue, I think that, it certainly was not an issue for the Department of Environmental Protection. If you, if you're up late at night and you are looking for something to do on the internet and you want to do a little of your own research to make sure that I've clicked on the right buttons, I just want to mention, on the bottom of the slide, it talks about a couple of resources. One of them is the tie and bond dashboard on water rates and actually sewer rates. Tie and Bond is a water environmental firm, and they plug in all of this information. So you can click on each one of those little dots and find out what those communities do, how they're organized, and what their rates are. And you can see the other graphic at the bottom of this page is that for medium-sized water companies, our rates are, I think the last time I looked, were the 6th highest within that 41 town cohort. We did not set out to reinvent the wheel, so we looked around to say, okay, well, if we're a medium-sized water company, how do other medium-sized water operations run themselves? And most all of those, with the exception of 2 water districts on the Cape and us, run their water as a department of the town with the executive branch of government being the water commissioners under state law. So, while the day one structure was meant to be a day one structure, that structure also carries over long-term for some towns who have felt very satisfied with that hierarchy. And these municipalities are all around us. There's nothing, the other thing I think the governance group looked at was, well, is there anything particularly special about the municipalities that run their own water? And these are all great towns, but they're not any different than us. I spent a lot of time actually talking to the water superintendent in Attleboro. They have some of the craziest setup there. They provide direct water to customers in Mansfield, with pipes that Attleboro owns. They read meters in Norton. They get emergency water from Pawtucket, Rhode Island. I mean, it's the interrelationships of water really, I guess what I took away from it, really defy municipal boundaries. And Attleboro is a great example. I think I pointed out those other things, as did Mary. So what does this mean for you? I've said it. I see a gentleman here who was at the forum that we hosted at the high school, who I think asked a question along these lines, wondering whether Hull would somehow be treated differently in all this. Ratepayers are ratepayers. When you fill out the business plan for the Department of Environmental Protection, it asks you to list your rate structure, and it's a residential rate, a commercial rate, and you can have an ascending rate. So based on consumption, you can get charged more for the more water you use. But there's not within a system a Hull rate, a Cohasset rate, and a Hingham rate. Ratepayers are ratepayers. Again, Mary talked about the accelerated capital spending, $2.7 million earmarked for year one. We will take a look at existing engineering studies, and then we would intend to update those. A break in the system is a cost to the entire system. So we need to deploy the capital where we need to fix these pipes. And again, as water commissioners for the system, that's the way we would evaluate the deployment of those dollars. You know, the ability to coordinate with your road building program. So, you know, on an annual basis, like Mary said, and I'm sure this is what you're doing as well, we sit down, these are the roads that we're going to pave, and we invite all of the utilities to come in. And Randy can speak to this afterwards if you like. And, you know, we try to coordinate those projects. Are we going to get every single one of them? No. But we have an opportunity to help you make sure you're using your road building dollars efficiently, and we can piggyback on that in trying to figure out whether we can fix some of those mains while those roads are open. And then local access to water system service providers and leadership, and a local rate setting process. You know, you can come to our town hall. Folks, it's been great to see a bunch of folks from Hull have been at almost every meeting now for the last several weeks. Several folks, as I mentioned, came to our forum. You know where we are. We're your neighbors. We pay the same rates. We're drinking the same water. We need the shower to get to work. We need our water to be on. And so we think that we're all in this together. And then, you know, the institutionalization of the role of the public voice, you have a role, a direct role on the Citizens Advisory Board, which would have direct access to both the water superintendent and the Board of Selectmen as the water commissioners. So I think I've really covered the Citizens Advisory Board, except to say, you know, I'll make the point again, they're subject to the Mass Open Meeting Law, Mass Public Records Law, state ethics rules, and they're very common in other systems. So it was another reason, I think, to add it to our system. You know, I guess the other thing I took comfort from, and I guess I hope you take some comfort from, is that as neighbors, we've worked together on a host of other things. You provide us with wastewater treatment services. We work together on SHREC. We provide mutual aid. We work together on evaluating the Summer Street corridor. And we will work together. We have to work together on coastal resiliency efforts. And our intention in the near term is to provide a memorandum of understanding that would set forth the rules and regulations that we would intend for all ratepayers to abide by. You know, cross connection, water turn on, water turn off, all of those things would be memorialized in a memorandum of understanding and would be the same rules across the board. Water system finances, you know, touching briefly on it, again, very common in municipalities operating their water. Really, I think the only way to do it is to segregate the funds from all of the other funds for the town of Hingham, and that way any retained earnings from the water system would drop to the bottom line of the water system. And the budget that we will propose to town meeting shows a first year drop to the bottom line of $4.8 million. And our thought is, you know, that could be used to establish a rate stabilization fund or a capital reserve, and certainly gives us some comfort in the year one operation. The rate setting process, probably should have used the white box with black print, but the rate setting process essentially will follow our budget process, which essentially follows your budget process. You know, so there'll be budget deliberations in the fall, budget message in the fall, deliberations by both the Board of Selectmen and our advisory committee, a recommendation to town meeting of the budget, and then because the water commissioners have statutory authority, after the budget is set, the water commissioners would take a, you know, kind of a pro forma vote to adopt rates that would be based on the budget that's approved at town meeting. Oh, and I guess one thing I will say there is we would intend, again, shortly after ownership, should we be fortunate to get there, we would undertake a cost of service study. So we don't want to charge more for this than it takes to provide water. And so that would be, and again, a very common practice in municipal water systems, particularly periodically, to evaluate their cost of service. So we would undertake that, again, year 1, year 2, something like that. So what happens next? So our town meeting is April 22nd. We would issue a request for a proposal for a water system operating company. We would work to hire a water superintendent. We'd prepare the documents for bond issuance as well as short-term financing. We'd establish the committees we talked about, and we would send along the memorandum of understanding with you and with Cohasset. As Mary said, Aquarion has, under case law, an obligation of good husbandry. And then the other element that would need to take place during the transition phase would be working with the DEP to complete the regulatory transition. So the DEP, just because you buy it, it's not like when you're 16, you get your license and you get in the car and you think you can drive away. When you buy this thing, they don't let you drive away. So with DEP, there's a fairly comprehensive business plan that forces you to sit down and write down together, in our case, with the water system operator, all of the requirements to maintain a water system in the Commonwealth. And some of that is management related, some of it's technically related, some of it's financially related, and the DEP won't sign off on the transfer of the water registration or the ownership of the water system until you've jumped through those hoops, completed that form. And then every 3 years after that, the Department of Environmental Protection conducts what's called the sanitary survey, which I would liken to, almost like an audit process. So they go back and they make sure all the things you said you were going to do and all the procedures you said you were going to have in place, you actually do. So, again, we concluded that we think we can manage this business with much greater transparency. We have to. We're required to, just like you are under statute. We will commit ourselves to an accelerated capital investment because the health of our watershed and the health of our system demand it. There's just no other way around it. That's what we need to do to make this engine run. We will reduce the amount and frequency of rate increases. You heard me talk about the cost of service study. That would influence how fast rates climb consistent with the cost of the service, the cost of the lower green box, not the cost of the upper boxes. We'll improve coordination with town departments, Hingham, Hull, and Cohasset. And this is about the ratepayers, and we're all ratepayers. We did, Mary found this quote from the Hingham Light Board that was established in 1895, which is a principle that I think applies equally to our water system and the way we would intend to conduct the water system, and that is the town has introduced electric lighting for the benefit of its citizens and neither to make money at their expense nor furnish light at less than cost. So that concludes my presentation. I think, Mr. Chairman, if you will allow Chairman Healy.
Absolutely. Excellent job.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen from Hull. Mr. Chair, members of the board, Mr. Lemnio's council. My name is Paul Healy, and I don't have a PowerPoint presentation, but I just thought a brief description of the water system might help add to your understanding. The town of Hingham has a number of wells. There are 11 in total, 10 of which are used. It does not go through bedrock to draw the water. They're groundwater wells. We also have the Aquarion Pond. That you can see, it's up at Queen Anne's Corner in South Hingham. Most of the wells are in South Hingham. We have 2 water tanks. One is in South Hingham. It's referred to as the High Pressure District, and the other one is in Turkey Hill. And that provides the pressure that supplies water to the town of Hull and Cohasset. We're allowed to draw 3.51 million gallons of water per day. 1.2 billion gallons a year. I won't replow the same ground that my colleagues did, but the need for the infrastructure on this 100-year-old system is acute. Tuesday, we had a grant of location hearing, which basically means that our town engineer and the utility come before the board seeking permission to open up the roadway. National Grid proposes to put in a mile of gas line from the center of Hingham to 3A and 228 in the later summer months. And as part of that conversation, I inquired, was there any inspection done of the water main? The water main is a 22-inch main. It's a concrete asbestos main. It's 100 years old. And the industry stopped using that kind of product 40 years ago. And all of the utilities in our town, as a matter of course, in practice, are notified when the highway department does work. Consistent with our desire to not open up the roadway after it's been newly paved to extend the life of the road, we try very hard to make sure that if there's any utility work that needs to be done, we can coordinate with the utilities. It's my understanding that the town of Hull has done that as well, which I strongly commend, because it's a good cost-saving measure, and it can bring your roadways up to a fairly acceptable level of service in short order. The problem we have, however, is that the water company is independent and does not work with the same level of cooperation that we experience with other utilities. They haven't been out to inspect. They haven't taken any action to determine if the joints are secure. So what we're looking at is replacing the gas line, and our assistant town engineer informed us that our rate of replacement of the gas main is almost without parallel in the Commonwealth. We can't say that for the water mains in the community. As Mary pointed out, the rate of replacement on the water mains is frankly unimpressive, notwithstanding their CEO's representation the other night at a public hearing that infrastructure is what it's all about. We as a community have over the years worked proactively in all different formats to protect our water supply, your water supply. That's included aggressive permitting, ensuring that nitrates don't permeate the aquifer. We have purchased through town meeting vote 133 acres of open space all around the aquifer, the wellhead protection areas, and this is a commitment that we've taken independent of anything that the water company has done. And in fact, we invited the water company to join us in this effort, and they declined. So, we as a community have done all that we could and can, except for this. So this is what we're doing now. I'm reflecting back, I'm rolling off the board. I've served the town of Hingham for 37 years in various capacities. And, as I reflect on my experience with the town of Hull, it's an enjoyable one. As a policeman, I worked the midnight to 8 shift, and I'd sneak in a Hull at dawn and join your guys at the Cozy Nook for breakfast, and it was always friendly. And my most recent experience coming into this room was on the 3A task force, and I have to say I really enjoyed the experience. We came in here 4 times. You were gracious. You invited us. I thought the conversation was respectful, and frankly, we listened to you. And we modified what we had originally intended to do. And, there's no question in my mind that we can work cooperatively with the Hull community at all. And, I believe that Eversource, doing business as Aquarion, is trying to sow the seeds of fear into the community, and I resent that, because I think we've shown over and over and over again that we work well together. I worked the blizzard of '78, and you know, I can remember bringing in you know, supplies to the people who were devastated by that incredible storm. You know, we have the Shrek, we have the library, we work on these, you know, roadway projects. The communication we enjoy is open and frank and robust. And I thank you for your support. I truly do. I think this is the right move for this area, this community. And we together possess the will and the ability to improve the infrastructure of the water system so that it works for us. So that when I go to that back room and say, hey, how's the water? The guy doesn't say, well, the kids downstairs drink spring water. I'd like to come in here and say, how's the water? It's great. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Healy. Members of the Hingham Selectmen, Selectwomen, excellent job. A very strong, compelling case. Just about everything in there that you've said is things that I know we've talked about regarding the water company over the years. And I'll just share an experience. I was with, at the Aquarion hearing that they conducted in Hull, I think in January or February, I can't recall when it was, and the experience of being at that forum and this forum tonight is night and day. They were very accusatory. I think I became the subject of many of their comments and questions and put on the spot. But the moral of the story is I think they are very afraid. I think they've known that they've dropped the ball for many years. As the selectmen have said that their shareholder takes precedent over their ratepayer, and that is the fundamental flaw in their setup. And it's not no fault of their own, but they're in an environment in which they just can't succeed to the quality of service that we as ratepayers and the ratepayers within all of our communities deserve. So again, excellent job. Thank you very much. Very strong, compelling case. I wish you the best on the 22nd. I wish I could be there to cast a vote in favor. I will personally share that I have full confidence in the prospect of you purchasing the system, and I really hope that the ratepayers and the voters of Hingham also agree with me and follow suit. But before we continue, I just want to turn to the members of our board and see if there's any questions or statements that you have for Hingham. Mr. Riley?
I had a couple of questions. Yeah, this might be getting ahead of the process a little bit, but there's a few things over the years that we sparred with, not just Aquarion, the water companies before them. And there's always been a few things in Hull that have really stuck out, that really irked us. And you've addressed some of them in your presentation. And one of the things is when they did the plant in Hingham, the fact that they turned around and leased it, they took out a bond, a state-funded, subsidized bond at a low interest rate, and they turned around and they leased it back to their own company for a much more substantial price, and then turned around and hit all the consumers for the price, not just to pay for the bond, but a profit built on top of that. That's something that started the whole thing and got us on the buses going up to the State House back 20 years ago. The other question I have is, when I started on the board, it used to be a $100,000 a year cost to provide access to the fire hydrants. That's whether the fire department used 100,000 gallons or a gallon of water, just to have the main there and have access to the water. Over the years, it's up over $200,000 now. Is that something that would be continued if the purchase was to go through?
No, I would think we would evaluate emergency water provision both to Hull and to North Cohasset. And I was reading Aquarion's rules and regulations in it, and maybe Mr. Lemnios can shed some light on this. But it sounds like they're buying your fire hydrants too.
Well, the way the argument has gone with DPU over the years is that 100 years ago, 75 years ago, at some point in time in the far distant past, the water system was designed to accommodate fire hydrants, and as a result, the pipes had to be larger than if the hydrants did not exist, and all the infrastructure that is behind those hydrants, including the pumps and the pump stations, had to be considerably larger. And that was the rationale for putting in place a hydrant charge. And some of the hydrants are owned by the town of Hull, or all the hydrants are owned by the town of Hull. The other thing that this goes to kind of the maintenance question, what we also learned over time with our hydrants is, in standard water installation, you would have a hydrant and you'd have a gate valve on each side of that hydrant. So if there was any need to service that hydrant, you could operate the gate valves and isolate just the hydrant. Well, in Hull, many of our hydrants had no gate valves on either side. And so as we have been replacing those, and we've been spending not only about, I think it's close to almost $300,000 a year for the hydrant charge, but an additional $40,000 a year in hydrant replacement. We've had a capital program to try to replace hydrants. And as Aquarion has been putting mains in and replacing them, we've been getting them to also add 5 or 6 hydrants a year or something along those lines. So, to Selectman Riley's point, we would hope that as the system gets up and running, and we know Hingham has a similar charge. You also
Right,
have
we
a
have it,
hydrant
right,
charge
right.
and so forth.
Right.
And the fact is it apparently never gets depreciated. I mean, the 20-inch pipe that's in the ground, I guess just we keep paying for it, although it never gets replaced. It's constant depreciation, and communities are spending between Hull and Hingham, I would imagine, we're upwards of $600,000-700,000 a year on this hydrant charge that has nothing to do with replacing hydrants, has nothing to do with servicing hydrants. It just has to do with this concept that was bought by the DPU many years ago, that the ability to have hydrants at some point, people are going to be paying for ad infinitum.
And you think about, as Karen said, a cost of service study is, what is the cost of providing service?
Right.
And if you think about the DPU setting, it's a different orientation. It's what can we charge the ratepayers? Let's look for every possible way we can charge the ratepayers. And so it would seem to me that a cost of service study is going to be very helpful in a lot of different ways.
I'd like to make 2 comments. One about the water treatment plant. In the course of investigating Aquarion's finances, what we saw was there's really 2 companies, as I think you know. There's Aquarion Water Company of Massachusetts and Aquarion Water Capital. The Aquarion Water Company is regulated by the DPU. Aquarion Water Capital is not. Aquarion Water Company, in the most recent rate case, was authorized at 10.5% return on equity that Mary talked about. What isn't as visible is the 14 to 15% return on equity that Aquarion Water Capital enjoys through what's called percentage rent, which is the profit that's baked in, which is why a $37.7 million plant will ultimately cost upwards of $125 million instead of less than $100 million. I think the other point that I would make, in addition to what Selectmen Power and Johnson have said, is that the either now sitting or upcoming chair of the Department of Public Utilities is a former Eversource executive. So to believe that the DPU is going to be protecting ratepayers, I think there's a relationship there that's in conflict with that objective.
Slimnios?
I don't know, I'll wait for other selectmen first. And then
Oh, I thought you wanted to comment.
I'll
I'll
just
continue
comment
with the
on
board. Mr.
Couple
Riley?
more questions. The other thing that got to a lot of people in Hull is that we were paying, just like the Hingham consumers, for the construction of the water treatment plant. But then just a few years after that came online, they're mixing the Hull water at the Turkey Hill plant, so we're getting a mix of Cohasset water rather than treated water from the plant that the town's paying for. Would there be any change in that situation? And part of it was because they were doing a water wheeling to some other developments. Would those agreements continue moving forward? Linden Ponds, for example?
Right, I mean, I think,
Separate,
I think on day one, on the day one takeover, we drop into the shoes in the operation that Aquarion has. So things would stay static for that year. And then I think between the engineering study and the cost of service study, I think we would move forward in evaluating, the operation of the system. And frankly, that's where the transition team comes in, as well as the Citizens Advisory Board. So I guess it's kind of a technical question for me to answer tonight, but I think that the operation of the system would be fully evaluated under municipal ownership.
Okay. Which I understand, like I said, I might be getting ahead of the process by some of these questions, but these are concerns that have come up multiple times over the years.
Right. Sure.
You talked about the Citizen Advisory Board, and I was just curious, how many customers do you have in North Cohasset?
Like about 400?
3 to 400.
334.
And I understand
I think I had that on the slide, I should have known.
that Hingham would have the lion's share with 3, being, you're taking the lead on it and purchasing it. However, if you want to have some sort of equal representation on that committee, why would Hull, with many thousands of customers, have the same representation on it as Cohasset that only has 334?
Yeah, I think it's a good point. I think the governance group looked at it, more as a consensus-building group and not kind of a representative, democracy kind of group, so that there'd be a voice from Hull and a voice from Cohasset. To be honest with you, we didn't want an unwieldy committee. So that's why we picked 5. And, I think if we think it's not working, we can certainly evaluate it. But it was meant to just provide an avenue in for both of the neighboring communities to be institutionalized in the process.
I understand that, but moving forward, let's say 3 years down the road, you think you have to change the makeup of that committee. Is this something you'd have to go back to town meeting and get approval of, or can the water commissioners
No.
themselves do that?
The water commissioners would be able to do that.
Okay. All right, and the other thing was the transition team. I would like to see maybe a member from Hull and Cohasset on that transition team also, not just volunteers from the Hingham committees.
And the transition team, I think that's a great point. I think what we would look for in the transition team would be, and you probably have a similar process in Hull, where folks can fill out and sort of self-nominate, fill out a form and disclose their qualifications and self-nominate for, a variety of boards and commissions. And so I think that we would look to utilize that process, because I think part of what we're doing with what we would want to do with the transition team, as you suggest, is, potentially geographic representation, but also skill set representation, because it really will be a working group that will be an important part of the transition process.
I just have one final comment, and again, this is getting way ahead of things, but as you know, the Strawberry Hill water tank was taken down in town a number of years ago, maybe 5 years ago or so, but, and I'm just a layperson on it, but since they took it down, it seems like we've had more breaks in town, and part of that, I would think, is the added pressure that might have to be put into the system to get the water all the way down to the far end of Hull, which, and it's not just it's a pressure it's not a steady pressure, gravity fed, it's something that, can go up and go down and can, the pipes are in such bad shape to begin with that the varying pressure could cause damage to the pipes. And again, I'm just a layperson, but it's something I think that the study committee would have to look at. And also, I do have fear that I can think of 3 times that we've had major main breaks coming into town, back at the town line. If we were to have a water break like that, and we needed pressure coming into town, there's no reserve water for fire suppression. At one time, the tank did serve that purpose, and if there was a water main break or emergency, there was hundreds of thousands of gallons there available if needed. And I know there's been some discussion with the professionals in this, but it's something I think that really has to be looked at and definitively determined if it's something that has to go back up what's happening there, so.
I'll just, it's puzzling to me why that was taken down. I know that in the out years of Aquarion's 5-year capital plan, there's an entry that says, put it back up for a couple $1 million. I forget which year. But what we contemplate is in year one, actually retaining an outside firm to do a capital asset evaluation and look, and then prioritize what needs addressing and start applying the capital that we've built into the financial plan to start doing that and doing it on a regular basis every year.
And as part of that capital plan process, it presents an opportunity for greater coordination with all town departments and town committees. So it's a water supply committee, it's the fire department. We have fire suppression challenges in parts of Hingham.
Yes.
And, you know, right now, again, it kind of gets back to this sort of accountability. And, you know, we sort of feel like we're an observer watching a lot of these decisions being made, and that the voice and some of the concerns aren't necessarily being heard and incorporated into the decision process. So, again, it's some of that coordination we think will be very helpful in informing and prioritizing and doing what's right for our entire system.
Well, I thank you. I thought the presentations were very well done. I appreciate you coming down and delivering it to us this evening. And I know the various Hull boards over the years share your frustration in dealing with the water company and their lack of response to our needs and our concerns. So thank you very much.
I'll go with Selectwoman Constable, then I'll go back to Town Manager.
First, I just want to thank Hingham staff and leadership for what I find to be a comprehensive, and I know it was a diligent evaluation process in pursuing whether or not you'd make the acquisition. My first question was, and Selectman Riley somewhat asked this question, was about the Citizens Advisory Committee. So based on the connections that were discussed, Hingham has 62% of them, Hull has 35%, and North Cohasset has 3%. I would actually make the ask this evening that the town increase Hull's representation to 2, for what I would find to be a fair representation. I think that you alluded to in the presentation that some of the decisions would be based on, or at least taking strong consideration, recommendations that came out of that Citizens Advisory Committee. And then my other question is around capital improvements. I think it was discussed and acknowledged that we all have quite an aging infrastructure. So how would the capital improvements, and at times I suspect there'll be competing priorities, how will the capital improvement process take place?
So as we've been asked this question several times, and I point out a couple of things. First of all, the financial projections call for $2.7 million in each of the next 30 years. So the overall capital spending in the system is going to rise. We're all going to rise. Capital improvements are going to be prioritized by need, not by geography. Because again, if we have aging infrastructure, we have pipes that are leaking, we haven't talked about unaccounted for water, that's another issue, it brings the whole system down. So we are fully aware that the pipes in Hull are among the oldest in the system and the smallest. And that in many ways, those two things are partially contributing to some of the issues around discolored water during peak usage, to water main breaks. So this is going to be based on need, because if as a system we're having a significant amount of emergency repairs on water mains continuously, we're just throwing money down the drain. So that would be the thought with capital.
I'll just jump in and say, in the planning that we did with capital, we envisioned spending $2.7 million a year for the first 3 years, and then it dips to about 2.5, because we were mimicking, the expert that evaluated our plan was mimicking Aquarion's plan. Then we escalate that amount by 5% every year and the borrowing rate. So by 2049, we're talking about $3.7 million a year. The average amount that would be put into capital, by my calculation, exceeds what Aquarion has put into all of its Massachusetts operations over the last 10 or 15 years. So I would agree with what Mary has said. It's in all of our interests as ratepayers to fix where the problems are the worst, because otherwise we're going to be paying more with emergency water main break fixes.
Okay, and just one final question. Was there, and this might be a little bit outside the acquisition analysis, but was there any consideration given to capacity and projected development?
So under the DEP, as Selectman Healy pointed out, there is a withdrawal limit that is set by the DEP. And so that's the kind of available water supply. One of the big things, and again, it was one of the compelling factors in the study, is that in our water system, the unaccounted for water, which is the water withdrawn from the aquifer that doesn't make its way into all of our faucets and things, in 2012, when we initiated the study, it was 24%. That means out of every 100 gallons that came out of the aquifer, only 76 of them were getting into the system, but that 100 was counting against the withdrawal limit. And so in 2012, we sort of said, you know, in some ways, we don't necessarily have a water supply problem, we got a water management problem. And in fairness, in the last 7 years, the unaccounted for water has improved. Last reported, it's at 16%, which is still above the DEP standard of 10%. But, you know, as we think about searching for alternative methods of supply, alternate supply sources, or potentially petitioning the DEP for an increase in withdrawal limit, what we've been told is the DEP is not going to pay any attention to us when our unaccounted for water is 16%. So we got to fix that problem first. And actually, from 16% to 10% unaccounted for water, I'm looking at John because he knows the number, it's
It's hundreds of millions of gallons.
like 180 million gallons a year, which I think is equivalent to, you know, 2,400 households, the annual consumption of 2,400 households in our service area. So as we think about water supply and water supply management, step one, get the unaccounted for water down. And I just add that the community of Hyannis, who purchased their water system in 2005, their unaccounted for water was pretty high, and last year it was down at 6%. So imagine if we could do a better job managing the water supply we have. That translates into millions of gallons of water. And frankly, the DEP, I think, is helping to make sure that there is an appropriate balance so that we are managing the water supply. We all know that the Weir River watershed is a stressed watershed, that designation is significant. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you.
It's highly stressed, and that's a designation that the DEP provided to it. And that was in response to Aquarion seeking to use the emergency well to develop further capacity, 2004, and the DEP rejected that completely. So we have one emergency backup well within the Free Street cluster, but capacity is a genuine issue all around. We did an extensive analysis studying the Derby Street corridor, and we've concluded that there's about 250,000 gallons of capacity left for purposes of development, you know, which is virtually nothing. So the unaccounted for water needs to be grappled with effectively, or else we're literally dead in the water.
Okay. And that is good to hear, because I'm aware of potential development in South Hingham, so to know that you've looked at it already and identified it,
Extensively.
that's good. Okay, thank you.
Did you, Mr. Lemnos,
Just
did you
a
want
couple of comments. First of all, members of the Hingham Board, thank you very much for being here, and Tom, thank you for coming, and Mr. Asher, who is the gentleman down at the end of the table, has been, I think, on the Water Study Committee since its inception. And that committee was a very impressive committee. I've had the opportunity to appear before the committee on numerous occasions, and the town of Hingham was very, very well served by the broad skill set that was on that committee and under the able guidance of Mr. Asher. So thank you, very much for being here. And, you know, what I find, you know, very compelling and interesting about this proposition is, first of all, for the first time in 140 years, ratepayers themselves will be selecting the rate. That just really is a very monumental thing, and it's something that both Hingham and Hull enjoy with their light departments, which are very well-operated light departments. The model that they're talking about is very similar, that Hingham was talking about is very similar to the model that we have with the Hull Municipal Light Department, where we have a light board, we have management, we have an outside company that comes in and does the day-to-day work, but we have our own staff that rides herd on that company to make sure the quality control is there. And that's exactly the model that Hingham is talking about, and quite frankly, it's a very common model for many, many cities and towns in the Commonwealth, and I suspect actually across the country. So I think there's every reason to believe that that model can be successful, because there are ample examples where it is successful. When you look at, there was one comment that was made, I think Selectwoman Powers mentioned that, or maybe Chair mentioned that there are quite a few Hull residents that have been attending Hingham meetings over the course of the last couple of months. Do you know how many Hull residents or Hingham residents were able to attend the DPU hearings held in Boston during the day, working day? 0, because they couldn't take time off from work to go to those meetings. And they couldn't, you know, to get into Boston and to pay for the parking and to basically, and then, by the way, there was portions of the DPU hearings that information was held in confidentiality that was not disclosed to the public and would not be disclosed to the public at the request of Aquarion. This is an opportunity for ratepayers to, every 2 weeks, every 4 weeks, go and appear before the water commissioners and say, here's my problem, what are you going to do about it? That is not available to ratepayers currently. We don't know when the rate cases are coming. We don't know what the magnitude of the rate cases are going to be. We usually have to scramble like heck between the various attorneys, Jim Lamke and the attorneys, Kerry Ryan from Hingham, and we're outgunned and outmatched. They come to the hearings. As a matter of fact, I think there's an Aquarion hearing attorney here right now. And could you tell us how much per hour Aquarion is paying you right now? No. Okay. If you ask that question in after this is done, public information, you'd get an answer. He won't tell you. But if it's owned by a public community, you're going to get that answer. It's available to you. You won't. Could you tell us how much John Walsh made last year? He's the head of the Massachusetts Aquarion Company. You won't tell us that. I won't.
Can I ask all of my questions?
Yeah, I know. Well, I guess it will be up to the chair.
Well, once
But-
we're done, just process, I think you arrived late. Once we're done here with our discussion, I'm going to go to the audience.
So,
But in serious,
So actually,
I'm
sir-
not here to answer questions.
right.
Yeah, we'll let town manager finish.
But I guess
it
my
out.
point is illustrative of the fact that that information's not available to ratepayers, okay? And it will be available. The superintendent that is running this system, the salary of that individual will be known to all ratepayers, okay? So the transparency factor of local ownership, it's night and day, and it should not ever be underestimated. The access to the people that are making decisions on capital, on rates, and so forth is night and day, all right? The other big issue in my mind is, you know, out in California, PG&E, which is Pacific Gas and Electric, just, you know, provides electricity to, you know, a big swath of the state. And you may recollect about 6 months ago, there was a huge fire in a portion of California, and hundreds and hundreds, thousands of people got burned out of their homes. And it's been demonstrated that PG&E was responsible for that. So what did they do? Instead of starting to write checks, they went bankrupt, and now all the people who own those homes are just a creditor. They're just in line. I'd much rather have local ownership like we have with Hull Light, with Hingham Light, because the responsibility is local. If something goes wrong, the response has been sell the system to somebody else. You know, we keep talking about Aquarion. It's really Eversource, but they're really not stepping up because they've shielded Eversource from anything that will go wrong with the way they've structured the whole deal. You'll never get to talk to anybody at the top of Eversource if Aquarion is screwing up. Here you're going to have a chance if the water commissioners, who at the beginning of this process are going to be the Board of Selectmen, if they screw up, they're going to get voted out of office. That's what will happen. And another set of Hingham residents will be voted in to fix the problem. So, you know, after 140 years, to finally have it back under control of the ratepayer for a essential, non-bargainable element in all of our lives, you know, thank God you guys took the action. I can only applaud, you know, the many years of effort on behalf of the officials in Hingham for taking back control of, you know, something that we all need. This isn't like, you know, if I don't like what Stop and Shop is selling, I'll go to Whole Foods or something else. There's no choice. And that's why public light companies were formed 100 years ago, 120 years ago, and that's why when you look at the Massachusetts map, the overwhelming model of ownership is local ownership under citizen control. Because this is a commodity that you cannot do without, and there is no alternative source. Either you're getting it from your watershed, or I guess your alternative source is to buy, you know, bottles of water and use bottles of water constantly. So that's my comments, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Lemios. Okay, that concludes our portion of these discussions. So I'm going to turn to members of the audience. If you have any questions or comments or statements. I saw a bunch of hands. I'll go with the gentleman here first, then ma'am, then Mr. Gould. I'm going to make you wait, sir. Sorry. Sir, just identify yourself.
Jim Watson, 291 Rockland Street, Hingham, just on the local west corner. And I very much support the proposal. I think an important thing that was hinted at is the need to check the supply as we facilitate acquisitions of the wells and through regulations, but also to enhance the supply. And given the stressed nature of the river watershed, publicized, and the limitations from the Water Management Act, I think it's very important to increase recharge where you can. And it's something which I do, some which has galleries put in and the stormwater goes down back into the ground. Some just go in the pipes and take it to the stream. And I talked to some developers and said, well, you know, it needs to be enforced that it has to be recharged. But what I'm wondering is the way the same is being able to buy some money with water from the river because it's protecting the water from this pipe. I hope that we can also do discrete selective retrofitting of some of the drainage. Particularly in Southend, in cooperation with the private owners and in cooperation with the regulatory bodies, so that it's protected and enhanced. And congratulations, it's really well done job.
Thank you, Mr. Washington. Thank you. Ma'am?
Alice Sloan, 12 Harborview in Hull. I'm curious about the water loss that's been talked about. With those numbers, is that something that a third party looks at, or is it just from Aquarion telling you it went from 24% to, what I remember is 24% to
16.
to 15?
So the DEP considers unaccounted for water one of the performance measures. And so all water systems are required to report. It's a self-reporting mechanism, but all water systems are required to report to the DPU their unaccounted for water on an annual basis.
You can access those reports online. If you go to the Department of Environmental Protection website, you can get their most recent reports. They typically come out about 6 or 7 months after the end of a calendar year. So the latest I've seen is for 2017.
Is it verified by a third party? Or is it just
No,
No,
it's
it's
a self-reported number, and I would say looked at. As was remarked earlier, the unaccounted for water in our water system got up to close to 25%. I believe that one of the reasons that Aquarion started applying more diligence to reducing it was the result of the study and the fact that we surfaced that this measurement existed, which none of us had heard of or seen in water quality reports that periodically were forthcoming. As a result of that focus, the DPU, the regulator for rates, has tasked Aquarion with reporting out its unaccounted for water and actually its performance in terms of reducing leaks in each of its rate case submissions. And you can see those online if you want to dive into the DPU file room, which is an exercise, and I won't say transparency, but more like opacity.
I'd just add one more thing with the calculation of unaccounted for water. If your water system does a flushing program, the gallons that you estimate as being flushed don't count in the denominator of that calculation. And I think it's worth noting that Aquarion has not been able to tell us prior to 2015 what the frequency and number of times our system has been flushed is. But again, I think what we saw last year for maybe the first or second year is that the entire system was flushed. And I would just point out that when you flush the whole system, that helps your unaccounted for water calculation because those gallons are taken out of the denominator. So to the extent that we hear that there's improvement in unaccounted for water, we need to keep in mind that, for example, in 2015 and 16, the water mains weren't flushed. So I think some of that improvement is a little bit of math.
And just want to comment that I definitely support Select Board Riley and Select Board Member Constable in having more representation going forward from Hull, because we have so many people using we're part of the ratepayers. I think that we deserve better representation as part of that going forward. I think that's in good faith.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'll recognize Mr. Gould, and I'll go to Mr. Burns, and then the gentleman over here. Mr. Gould?
And I have a couple questions. First of all, Randy Gold, 2 Cushing Street in the village. Again, thank you for Hingham. Hard for me to say that, thank you for coming down here. And I haven't been to any of the other presentations. And also, through the Board of Hull Selectmen and Phil, because this is the Board of Selectmen's meeting, I'd like to thank the Hull Electric Light for replacing all the parking lot lights that were deficient, and it's a lot more aesthetically pleasing than they were. But to Hingham, I have a couple of questions. When Hingham Water, and I remember Hingham Water, sold to American, whoever it was, why didn't you pick up the option then? Is there a reason?
Hingham has, in its history, contemplated purchasing the water company several different times. But it has never gotten to the point of, for example, determining the purchase price. And there were times when there was dissatisfaction with, the way the water system started was there were a bunch of Hingham residents that wanted to expand the water system, and the town said no, and they said, okay, we'll buy it and do it ourselves. So there have been periods of dissatisfaction. I think a couple of times town meeting said that it wasn't interested. I would say that it's never been studied in as comprehensive a manner as it has in the last 7 years.
So what I pick up on this is basically Aquarion drove you to it. Because I have nothing, absolutely nothing good to say about Aquarion. I've dealt with them on 2 water main break, 1 water main break and 1 break on their meter side of the street at my house. They charged me $249. They didn't care the water was just running out. They charged me $249 to come down and shut the water off to my house. And that was in my next bill. The next time I had an experience with them. The 6-inch main out in front of the house was broken, ran from 11 o'clock at night, and they didn't get to it until 6 o'clock the following night to fix it. That's a 6-inch main gushing down the street, and they talk about conserving water. So I have nothing good to say about Aquarion. I wanted to touch on what John said about the tank. There's actually a couple of questions. The tank that used to be up in Strawberry Hill, do they still own that property?
I don't know the
I
answer to
don't know
that.
the
So
answer to that.
that's a good, I don't think
Really?
anybody here is, okay. Our real estate counsel is not here this evening, but she has meticulous records of all of the property and assets.
But after that tank disappeared, and nobody mentioned it tonight, but a couple of years ago, the fire chief in this town was getting phone calls because Turkey Hill was so far depleted, they couldn't guarantee fire suppression in this town that they needed it. That went on for quite a few months, and they got the call, I think, from the Hingham fire chief, because Aquarion never called out. So that's one of my reasons about Hingham. The only other thing I have is, there was something in the paper about when Aquarion bought the water company, they assumed that an $80 million debt, that's still in play? Liability debt, I don't know what it was for, but they bought it for like $160 million, 80 was for liability, and 80 was for the purchase price.
When was this?
I don't know, probably about 10 years ago.
Very tough to actually understand what the purchase price for Service Area A was, because Aquarion consolidates its financials. And so I'm not aware of the amount you're citing, just because they don't record it that way.
Yeah, it really caught my attention, because basically they were assuming a debt that was equal to what they were also going to pay for the company. So it was, you had to add them both together to get the purchase price.
An interesting statistic, again, and it gives you a sense of the profitability of water systems, is Macquarie bought Aquarion in 2007. That was the Australian company. In 2017, they bought it, and they paid $865 million for it. And there were about 219,000 water customers. 10 years later, Eversource bought the same company. They had added about 13,000 customers, so maybe 232,000. The purchase price was $1.7 billion. So in 10 years, with pretty much the same customer base, they doubled their profit. I think that speaks to the financial picture here.
I saw, one last one. This will come a couple of, Phil made a point about how you're going to operate the entity. And I'm seeing these newspaper articles from a couple of people. One was from a Hingham resident talking about, you need water resource people to run a water company. Well, it's like Phil said, it's no different than the Hull Electric or the waste treatment plant that we have. You're either going to take over the employees that are already there, because what better than the people who know the system. But then somebody else put in the paper, they wanted something in writing as a guarantee. I go, I don't remember getting one of those from National Grid or the waste treatment plant that I have a say in my water. It's there, I turn it on, and hopefully everything goes great. So just to put that to bed, because I see some of the writers aren't here tonight.
You're making a great point, and I think it's worth us saying it, that one of the criteria that we will include in a request for proposal for the operations and maintenance operator is that they offer preferential hiring to the existing employees of the Aquarion system, just so we get their institutional knowledge. They don't have to worry about, are they going to have a job Hingham Town Meeting votes to acquire.
I would have to assume that not we own it either.
Thank you, Mr. Gould. Mr. Burns?
I'll try, Tom Burns, 1 Clifton Ave, Hull. I'll try to be brief. Just want to emphasize what Mr. Lemio said, that a fundamental thing such as drinking water should be a municipally run, public-owned. You have a business model for profit where the shareholders need to make a profit on a central commodity. It makes no sense. I've been in Hull since the early 80s. I remember in the springtime we would get different color water. The impetus for a water treatment plant was there. That was great. Everyone bought in on that. I want to echo a little bit with what John Riley said about the bait and switch. We paid for a water treatment plant. That went to Linden Pond, Derby developments. What we got was Cohasset water from Lily Pond. There were problems with that water system from Cohasset, which hopefully got straightened out, but it was not the same quality that what we paid for. It was emphasized that the infrastructure in Hull is probably the oldest in the system. We have some of the most corrosive soils around. As you mentioned, we have the smallest pipes, we probably have the greatest leaks. The way Hull was developed more in a coastal community probably didn't have the same standards as Hingham, so I think we'll see more infrastructure issues in Hull. And the last thing I would like to emphasize, the Citizen Advisory Committee, great idea. It probably should be more representative with the users, would be patterned after. If there's 8,000 users in Hingham, 4,000 in Hull, a fraction in Cohasset. I think Cohasset should get some representation, but the other two representations should be similar, just for, we talked about transparency and parity. I think that would go a long way. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Burns. The gentleman's here, sir, and then I'll recognize you, sir. Sir?
Hi, my name is Richard Booth. I live at 1181 Nantasket Avenue. And I heard two very important things tonight that I hadn't heard clearly before that are critical to my recommendation to our Board of Selectmen and other people in town. One is that statement, again repeated, that there will be a memorandum of understanding. Was not clear when, but that's the start. Perhaps others have heard that it's been a guarantee, excuse me, not a guarantee, but a commitment. And that's very important because other than that, with only advisory committees and a minority on the board, Hull's needs could be outvoted. And with respect to the need for replacement of our system, particularly in the face of a sooner impact for climate change and sea level rise in Hull than other parts of the system, the issue of allocation of capital is going to be critical for us. And the statement from Selectwoman Powers about capital allocation to be based on need, not geography, is good. But when it comes down to it, it can be words unless the good faith is still there. And people come and go, and select people and people on the board and, excuse me, the committee could change. And animosity between the towns could affect the determination of where the greatest need is. And from what I'm trying to find out, that other than a memorandum of understanding, which unfortunately, I suppose is going to be non-binding, which it means nothing except good faith, and the approval of the DEP to the transfer, as Selectwoman Powers or said that there would be rules and regulations on how the management of the system. Well, what I would be looking for, and I would hope our representatives from the town of Hull would be looking for, is a commitment to allocate to firm up that determination of allocating capital expenditures on the question of need. What is the need, and who makes the determination? And most importantly of all, is if determination of need were to be consistently that the need is greater, stronger in some other part of the system than the needs in Hull, what remedy would we have? I don't know whether that would be a violation of the MOU, whether it not be a violation of the DEP permit, or whether we'd be just left out to dry. 'Cause they would obviously wouldn't be bald-faced bad faith. They would have their reasons for saying that the other places needed capital improvement instead of the. And I'm not talking about water quality because, obviously if the water's bad, the contamination or anything like that, DEP regulations will police that, and enforce the goodwill. But I'm not sure. I think there's one more step to find a little bit, to have more of a commitment that it could be enforceable when all of us are gone and other people there trying to do their best job and all that sort of thing. But the determination of needs don't go as fairly as we might think they should.
Can I speak to that, Mr. Chairman?
Yes, please. Thank you, Mr.
So,
Booth.
it's good to see you again. I know you were at the Water Forum. And I think I mentioned this at the Water Forum. The starting point we have now is zero visibility and zero voice in any determination of capital expenditure or no capital expenditure. So that's our starting point. If we don't make a change, we've got no ability to influence accelerated capital investment into the system. So that's our starting point. So if we move off the block because that's unacceptable to us, then the next question is, we've come up with a local option to run the system where the water commissioners are the fiduciaries for the system. They have the
Are they fiduciaries?
yeah, they have an obligation to run the system in the best interest of the system. So,
Council was quiet.
pardon me?
Council was quiet. They're not fiduciaries.
Mr. Booth, Mr. Booth,
Yes.
please let Selectwoman finish.
I'm sorry.
If you have an additional follow-up question, I'll allow you to ask her at that point.
Fair enough.
Ma'am?
And so we have a statutory obligation to run the system. I guess we're also your neighbor, and that was part of the reason why I put up the slide that I put up earlier. We cooperate, and Paul may want to jump in here and talk about this too. We cooperate on a whole host of things. We're not going anywhere. So to the extent that we are in disagreements over allocation of dollars, guess what? We're going to have to sit in a room and work that out. So I guess, we can surmise that people are going to come at this with a manipulative agenda to allocate dollars in one way or another. I can tell you that that is not our agenda, and that I think that there would be public recourse. You'd come to a meeting like this and be able to question someone on their capital plan. And I would suppose in the event of, extreme fraud, you've got some recourse to the Attorney General's office. But we've got to play this in public. So I think it's very hard to hide from the bright light of public meetings to manipulate the priorities of the water system. So, I can only tell you what I can tell you, and that is that we come to this with good faith, wanting to operate this system for the good of all our neighbors here, and we intend to do just that. I don't know. Did you want to?
Thank you. I'm going to recognize my colleague, Mr. Rado.
Real quick on the comment. Similar to what we did with our road studies, we hired an engineering company. Everybody thinks their road is the worst. We hired an engineering company to rate the roads, and that's what the town is going by on the paving. I'm sure that the water commissioners would have to really rely heavily on engineering reports on what has to be done first and a priority for the system. There could be instances, for example, it's going to take a lot of communication. Hull's embarking on a lot of road work. Hingham has their road work. We can't have, Hull's going to do 3 miles of Atlantic Ave while Hingham's going to do 5 miles there, and it would blow the capital budget of the water system to do both of those mains at the same time. So part of the MOU, even separate from, is just that the town administrators work together to map out how these roads are gonna go ahead, and everything kind of overlaps so that it works in harmony, not against each other. And it's gonna take, as I said, like any problem, it's gonna take a lot of communication and planning. And, but right now, I'll tell you, for 20 years, all my concerns about capital plans for the water system have fell on deaf ears. And what they said was the break and fix method of doing their capital plan is a failure. And we all know that, and I didn't see much really change in there. They got the surcharge for capital work, but as the bar graph showed, what they did in some years was zero, and that's not acceptable. I mean, they should have been some sort of plan. We begged for them to bond some of the projects and get a good chunk of the mains done, and they just didn't, and partly because it would lower their value to somebody that was looking to buy them out. If they didn't have any long-term debt, they were a better purchase for them, and that's what's happening. Every time, it's not just a water company. How many times has the name of your gas company changed, or the name of the phone company, or whatever? Every time one of these conglomerates buy out another company, they pass that expense on to the consumers, and that's what's been happening to us. I remember Hingham Water too. I remember Mass American. I remember Aquarion. I remember going up to the State House numerous times, and I lost all faith in the DPU system when I found out that it's just a revolving door of people that worked in the industry going in and out of there. That's why we fought with our legislators to get the Attorney General involved, to try to have another level of control. This supersedes anything the Attorney General can do. It just brings it down to the local level, and we all sit in a room, and we could be here for hours, but eventually we're going to come out with some sort of consensus. So, that's all.
Mr. Chairman, can I just make a comment?
Yeah, Mr. Mayor, sure.
Sure, thank you. So one of the other things that hasn't been brought up yet is we just finished the water superintendent job description the other day. And part of that job description, as it was graded, was identifying that this position is necessarily reporting to 3 independent governmental structures, governmental entities. That's a unique situation, not unique, but it's a little bit of a different situation across this, from other jobs, at least in the town of Hingham, where, this person is going to have to come before the Hull Board of Selectmen, is going to have to go before the Cohasset Board of Selectmen and the Hingham Board of Selectmen, talk about the systems and what's happening, going to have to work with myself, Mr. Lemnios, Mr. Senior, and Cohasset, and try to plan out the capital needs and how best to implement the necessary changes. So that position is vital, it's a key component, and it would certainly be somebody that I think the town managers and administrators would lean on.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. You all set, Mr.? Do you want to ask a follow-up, Mr. Booth, and then I'm going to go to this gentleman?
It just comment.
Sure, go ahead.
I'm just asking to try to put in a fail-safe. All the good intentions, all the working together, and communicating and advisory opinion and sitting fail in the sense that we feel ill-treated. There's no remedy, because we're outvoted.
Understood, thank you, sir.
Very quickly address, I'm sorry.
Go
I
ahead.
didn't hear his question.
It wasn't a question, it was just a comment. I guess the request was to see if there can be something worked in that has more of a fail-safe protection in the event that all the good faith and all the
If it fails, you settle
communication
back
doesn't
and you
work.
double your money like the other companies did.
You can sue Aquarion. You can't sue
Well,
municipal community.
It hasn't worked in
Unless
some
it-
other parts of the
Correct.
country, suing the company.
Sir,
Hi, my name is Paul Smith. I live on Nantasket Ave. My wife and I have lived in Hull for 15 years. I'm an expert in piping. I'm an expert on facilities. I'm an expert in electrical. I've worked for Halliburton, I've worked for National Grid. I've worked for Stone and Webster, designing, building, and operating facilities. I was at the presentation on Monday. I thought it was okay. The presentation tonight, I think, was excellent. Any reservations I had before tonight are gone. He did an excellent job. I just have a couple comments. Number one, the three selectmen are going to become the commissioner of water. First of all, I think it should be 5, not 3. Second of all,
We had that discussion last year. Yeah, that was last year's argument.
5 gives us the chance to get on the commission without throwing anyone off. If I said, so, I'm trying to make it so we all work together. If I said it was 3 and some of you guys are gonna go, you'd be fighting me. But if I say there was gonna be 5 and all 3 of you keep your job, it will be less resistance. All right, that's why I picked 5. I also am a little concerned about the background of a person who's a selectman becoming a commissioner. I've worked with a lot of people and was in charge of a lot of things, and I wonder, your background to become a selectman, and when you ran to be a selectman, we didn't look at your engineering background, we didn't look at your management background, we looked at how good a speech you were. So my question is that, what kind of training are you doing in the interim to get up to speed to become commissioner? You just don't walk in the job and say, okay, I'm going to take a course. You get prepared for it. I mean, I have 2 master's degrees. I got a master's degree in engineering and a master's degree in finance. Plus, I've written 2 best-selling books. People wouldn't let me run a big project just because I was a nice person and just because I could get votes. They gave it to me because I had a history of running jobs and getting things done. You guys, you're great, but you're getting this job really without really applying for it, because no one has looked at you and your background to see, do you have the technical background to actually do it? And why am I worried about it? Well, one of the places I think about is Flint, Michigan. Flint had these people that took over, and they thought they had the background, and they picked the wrong people. And when they got advice from people, they didn't listen to them, or they. So, for example, I was hearing that Viola is one of the consultants being considered for this group. And oh, by the way, Viola is the group that did Flint, Michigan. So I hope, number one, we don't repeat the same mistakes. If someone didn't do the job right, and when they did the job, when they were told they were wrong, and they didn't admit it, hopefully that's not the group that we're picking to work with us. So I hope we don't pick Viola. And the advisory committee, several people have said it today, that I think that we should have 2 people on it. I want to say that also. The memo of understanding, I hope it's more than a memo. I would hope it's more like a contract of understanding, not a memo of understanding. I hope that there's some kind of something behind it, some legal thing. When I hear the word memo, it kind of scares me. I really like the word contract of understanding.
Take a shot at the answer in that.
And I just hope in the transition to becoming the advisory boards and the commissioners, the thing is, I'm just hoping that you get some strong technical people to give you advice.
Yep.
Because, like Flint, we can't afford the mistake. And, you know, what John Riley said, I believe 100% what he said. I don't want to repeat his, because I'll be here all night. But John said some real good things, and I highly agree with what John Riley said. And I want to end by saying, you did a great job.
Thank you.
You very much.
Thank you, Mr. Smith.
I'd just like to respond
Mr. Healy, yes.
briefly, if I could. Your points are well taken, sir.
I'm not an expert in water distribution. Sitting in the room is a gentleman who is, and he happens to be our DPW superintendent. He's certified in this particular area of water management, and he in fact had intimate experience with the operation of the Hingham Water Company for almost 20 years. In terms of myself as a water commissioner or someone sitting in my seat, I'm relatively new to the town of Hingham. I've only been there about 55 years, and I've served the town for 37 years. And when I ran for the planning board, I knew nothing about planning, but I learned, and I learned as I went, and I was intensely invested in making decisions that were sound, and I had the benefit of experts to help me. People like you, engineers, consultants, and I've been involved in permitting the shipyard, derby shops, the Bone and Muscle, Blue Cross Blue Shield, Serono, most of the modern development in the community of Hingham I've had a role in. And memorandums of understanding are common in that field, in that world. It's my understanding that we have a memorandum of understanding with the T with respect to the tunnel that runs underneath Hingham Square. So your point's well taken. We remain open to the water commissioner concept. I think what we did was we chose the particular model and approach that we did because, one, it's the most commonly seen in the communities that we studied, and Ms. Johnson can certainly elaborate on that. But this is a work in progress for us, and we've reached out to the community, which includes the town of Hull, Service Area A, Hull, Hingham, and part of Cohasset. And we're incorporating the ideas and suggestions that we've received. But we need to act, and we simply can't wait any longer. So thank you for your suggestions.
Oh, and I'm not suggesting that you wait. I'm suggesting that you plan.
Appreciate that.
And sir, thank you. Somebody last night at the advisory committee, one of the members said, the Board of Selectmen as water commissioners, we're not going to be having Karen Johnson putting, chlorine in and Paul Healy mixing it and, me turning faucets. If I think about the very important role that the Board of Selectmen plays in many of our roles, we serve as the police commissioners. We serve as the fire commissioners. Our role are a couple-fold. First of all, our biggest role is to hire the best people to provide the technical expertise. And I think in Hingham we do that pretty well. The superintendent role just went through a really rigorous review process with the personnel board. So our job is hire the really good people. Our other job is make sure that the system has the resources it needs to be successful, which is a budgeting and a capital planning role that people in our seats do as a matter of routine. And, some of us have a finance background, others don't, but a lot of the water commissioner role, particularly in the first year or two, is setting this up to succeed. And it's also making sure that what we've heard along the way and the work that we've done is carried out. And we think that this body is best positioned to do that, but we also are going to have this transition committee evaluating whether that's the right option for the long term. The opportunity we'll have is we can choose that for ourselves if we purchase the water company. But if we don't know who's going to own it going forward. And that's going to create a lot of uncertainty.
Excellent, thank you. Hearing a potential water commissioner talking about our water company with the capital plan that we need to succeed is just music to my ears. So with that being said, I think I'm going to conclude the meeting tonight. I want to thank everyone for being here, for your input, for your questions, your comments. I want to thank our colleagues over in Hingham and your staff. We really appreciate it. We wish you the best of luck on the 22nd. Obviously, please keep us posted. And with that being said, I'm just going to take a brief break. Let's just break down, and then we'll wrap up our remaining business. So let's take a short break. Thank you very much.